All right, so it's a minute after 12. I think we'll go ahead and get started. We seem to have a critical mass, and I know people will continue to come into the meeting. So again, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kate Paisani, and I work at Carla. Before I introduce the talk, for which I am also one of the presenters, I just want to let everybody know that we have one more presentation this semester. It's on Wednesday, December 4th. There is a QR code and a URL on the slide if you would like to register to come. Karen just put that URL in the chat. You do need to register to be able to get the Zoom link. So today's presentation is part of Carla's Social Justice in Language Education Initiative, and I'm joined by my colleague Mandy Menke from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies here at the University of Minnesota. This is a project that we collaborate on with two other colleagues from U of M, Lauren Goodspeed in French and Italian, and Helena Roof in German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch. Mandy and I are representing the team today because other folks are teaching. So we are going to be talking about some of the research that we have been conducting on teachers of less commonly taught languages and how they understand social justice in language education as they created curricular units for Carla's project. So I'm going to pass things over to Mandy, who's going to get us rolling.
Before I get us started, I just want to make a quick comment, kind of a logistical comment. As we're presenting, we are not going to be monitoring the chat. And so feel free to back channel and things there. Just know that Kate and I won't be monitoring that until the end. And you can feel free to put questions in there that we will pick up at the end. We should have some time for questions and answers and conversation around the project and the research that we're sharing today. So in our presentation today, we are going to focus on three teachers of less commonly taught languages and how they conceptualized social justice in language education and related pedagogies as they created social justice curricular units as part of Carla's Social Justice and Language Education Initiative. So on the link that Karen put in the chat to the Social Justice and Language Education Project page, you can find the curricular units there. But we're going to begin by overviewing research on teacher learning, beginning with general findings on teacher learning and social justice, and moving on to findings specific to teachers of less commonly taught languages. So on this slide, we summarize 5 key findings from the research that has been done on teacher conceptualizations of social justice. And we've really simplified this down. So the first one is that teaching for social justice is complex and multifaceted. This complexity stems precisely from the multifaceted nature of social justice or critical pedagogies, which involve developing multiple skills and bodies of knowledge. More specifically, in language education, it means addressing and integrating various instructional foci, engaging with different perspectives on topics, and also thinking about variables related to the individual learning context, which ties us into our second finding, which is that teachers' understandings of social justice are influenced by that context. Context matters. What is possible in one educational context might not be possible in another context, depending on the support systems that are in place, the students that are part of that classroom community and their backgrounds and their preparedness, the larger community in which the classroom is situated, the curricular goals and materials, and more. And so one of the things that reports and research on teacher conceptualizations has found is that when we engage teachers in professional development, that provides them with deeper and more nuanced understandings of social justice and related pedagogies. More specifically, this opportunity to engage in professional development in a collaborative, ongoing manner has positively impacted their understandings. I pulled a quote from a report by Roof et al. That noted this. And this participant said, I don't want to feel like I'm out there on my own creating materials and then swimming with it all by myself. So, this idea of being in community and having this ongoing professional development has really emerged from within the scholarship on teacher conceptualizations. Finally, the fourth, I guess not finally, the fourth point there is that we must attend to students' linguistic, cultural, and social identities and positionalities when we're teaching for social justice. And this is part of the complexity, too, that we noted in that first bullet point. And so we're bringing in multiple instructional imperatives, and we know that integrating language and culture can be a challenge for teachers. And so this is something that teachers, as they prepare to teach for social justice, are cognizant of. And then finally, that social justice must be systematically integrated with other language learning goals. It can't be a one off or a standalone lesson, but rather infused or woven through other language learning activities. So, keeping in mind that teacher understanding is situated, it's contextualized. We wanted to look about what do we know about LCTL teachers. And really, we don't know much at this point. Most of what we know about teacher conceptualizations of social justice comes from work with teachers of commonly taught languages, with the notable exception of Kong 2022. Less work has been done with this group of language teachers. Previous research, however, has highlighted the importance of context in teacher understanding and implementation. And the context of our LCTL colleagues is different from those who are teaching commonly taught languages. And so we're going to summarize some of the variables that are unique to the LCTL teacher context that might influence how they understand and enact social justice. First is that they face, and I quote here, a narrow selection of materials that are often inadequate in terms of content, level, and pedagogical focus. And so, whereas those of us who are in, like I teach in Spanish and we have a wealth of materials, but in different languages, I hear this, we just don't have enough materials. And this is particularly true for LCTL teachers. The variety isn't there. And when they are there, the content might be dated. It might only focus on one particular community or variety that speaks that language. And the pedagogical underpinnings might not align with the pedagogies that the teacher wants to implement in the classroom. A second need that has emerged within the LCTL teacher research or scholarship is that LCTLs are typologically more distant from English, which impacts the learning process and teacher and student beliefs about that process. So we've heard about the hierarchy or the scale of difficulty in learning different languages. And this often gets played out, though, in the classroom, in that it can take longer for students to acquire the language, particularly the written language for our colleagues that work with, and I liked the way the one article referred to them, diverse written representations. And so that written piece can be a bigger challenge, but then also the beliefs that the students bring to the classroom about the language difficulty. So that is a unique constraint that LCTL teachers are presented with. In a similar way, the sociocultural and pragmatic considerations are different. And many times the culture is less familiar to students. And so it might feel more foreign to say it in that way. And so there's a greater distance that has to be bridged when we're thinking about the cultural content or the pragmatic considerations. And then this last bullet point is important to keep in mind because the LCTL teacher experience varies quite widely depending on the individual teacher's personal preparation, the connections that they have within their school, within the profession as at large, their own linguistic and cultural identity, and the local context within their teaching. So these are some of the unique constraints, or the contextual variables might be another way to put that, that in which LCTL teachers are working. So thinking about their unique context, we asked the question, how do post-secondary LCTL teachers conceptualize social justice in language education? So I'm going to turn it over to Kate at this point to talk us through how we approached this question and our findings.
As Mandy mentioned, we are focusing on 3 participants today, Carolina, Layla, and Willa. These are all pseudonyms. We did have a 4th LCTL teacher in our study, Amber. We have not included her in this analysis that we're presenting today because Amber is a teacher of Portuguese. So she's teaching a language with a Roman script. And she's also a first language speaker of English, unlike our other participants who are native speakers of the languages that they teach. So Carolina is a teacher and native speaker of Russian, Layla is a teacher and native speaker of Turkish, and Willa is a teacher and native speaker of Chinese. You can see on the table here that they all have extensive experience teaching language. And you can also see in the last column, the title of the social justice curricular unit that they developed for Carla. So Carolina focused on multicultural diversity in Russia and took students on a trip from Moscow to Dagestan. Layla focused on disability and accessibility and change makers who are influencing views of accessibility in Turkey. And Willa focused on multicultural and multilingual identities in China and practices and locations. Um, we want to point out as well that all of these teachers teach across the curriculum. So they're not just teaching lower levels of language, but they're also teaching 3rd and 4th year courses. This is an interesting point because they sometimes put their thoughts about teaching social justice at the intermediate level of the curriculum into dialogue with their experiences with upper level students. And there are some concerns about text difficulty and language proficiency related to what Mandy mentioned in terms of the previous research. So I just want to walk you quickly through the timeline for this project. We have been working on this project since December of 2020, and we have worked with 2 cohorts of instructors. The first cohort was teachers of French, German, and Spanish, and the second cohort was the LCTL teachers that we're referring to today. So in December of 2020, we provided professional development for both cohorts of teachers. They participated in a day-long workshop on social justice education. And then following the workshop, we asked them to complete an initial questionnaire that asked about their demographic information, their professional development experiences, how they see themselves as a teacher, how they define and implement social justice in language education, and how all of this connects to their professional identities. About 2 months after implementing the questionnaire, we interviewed each of the participants, asking some of the same questions from the questionnaire, but also going deeper into some of those topics. And then for the LCTL cohort, they began development of their curricular units in the summer of 2022. And so prior to that, we had them complete another social justice workshop that focused specifically on teaching social justice in LCTL classrooms. And then throughout the summer of 2022, each of the curriculum developers worked very closely with one member of our team to create a 2 to 3 or sometimes 4-week long curricular unit on a social justice topic of their choice. Whenever there was an individual consultation meeting between the curriculum developer and a member of the grant team, we recorded that for research purposes. And then during the 2022-2023 academic year, with the exception of Willa, who was on leave that year, the curriculum developers piloted the unit that they had created in an intermediate level course that they were teaching. And we went in and observed 2 to 3 lessons during piloting. We recorded those lessons, took extensive field notes, and then following piloting, we conducted a debriefing interview to talk about how piloting went, and then to repeat some of the questions that we had asked in the initial interview. And then finally, in summer of 2023, again, with the exception of Willa, who did her revisions the next year, Our curriculum developers revised their curricular unit based upon piloting feedback, as well as feedback from a social justice expert and a multiliteracies pedagogy expert. Those were the two pedagogies that undergirded the project. We recorded any individual consultations that took place during that revision process. And then once they turned the curricular unit into Carla for publication, we asked them to complete a final questionnaire that repeated questions from the initial questionnaire. The data that we're going to be focusing on today is questionnaire data, interview data, and consultation data. We will not be talking about the classroom data today. So this is a qualitative case study, multiple case study, and we did cross-case analysis using multi-cycle descriptive coding. And later on in the talk, we're going to be situating our findings within a framework called Domains of Teacher Knowledge, proposed by Goodwin and Goodwin-Darity. And we'll explain that framework later after we've presented the findings. So what did we learn about how teachers of Chinese, Russian, and Turkish understand social justice and language education? Our analyses uncovered three main themes in their thinking. The first is that social justice and language education is complex. As we've seen in previous research, we had a similar finding. It also centers diversity, and it has local and global impact. So I'm going to talk through some examples of all three of these themes. So the first theme is that social justice and language education is complex, and our findings show that this complexity is influenced by multiple variables. First, social justice and language education is complex because it requires intentional selection and evaluation of teaching materials, and these materials can both constrain and support teachers' classroom practices. For instance, our participants considered textbooks to be a constraint to social justice in the language classroom, as the quote on the slide from Carolina illustrates. She explains that in her many years of teaching Russian, not a single textbook I remember that I've encountered had a chapter on multicultural diversity. She goes on to explain that students are interested in the diversity of Russia, but are limited by textbooks that only focus on Moscow and St. Petersburg, which she points out is Western in a way. Whereas textbooks constrain the enactment of social justice in language education, teachers see multimodal texts as an affordance that can help them be responsive to students' needs. In one of her planning meetings, Willa discussed a video text in which Chinese speakers discuss food in different dialects, and her intent to use it as a warm-up activity. Her choice of the text was grounded in her students' experiences studying abroad. She explained, they're always overwhelmed by how different dialects are when they go study abroad in China, and they're so used to the instructor speaking Mandarin. So it will be very interesting to hear students' reactions to the video and lead into later activities. So I think that's a very good piece to be used at the beginning for students to experience. Finally, LCTL teachers see language as an additional factor that makes social justice and language education complex. For some participants, language is a way to connect to one's cultural heritage or to grapple with cultural differences. For Layla, language allows students to develop a lexicon to talk about social justice issues and to understand the marginalization of certain communities. Because textbooks are a hindrance to implementing social justice in the classroom, Layla turns to authentic texts to center language. As she stated, when we say social justice and language education, then the first question is, whose language are we teaching? And if I look at my textbooks, it's the language of the mainstream society, and it's the language of the society who has not been marginalized in one way or another. So in that way, using authentic texts related to marginalized people helps learners to acquire the language to talk about those issues. In addition to being multifaceted, LCTL teachers identified diversity as a central component of social justice in language education. In particular, they saw the exploration of social justice topics as a way of combating monolithic views of culture. Doing this involves deconstructing stereotypes, humanizing the other, and looking at both positive and negative aspects of target cultures. The quote from Layla on the slide captures these ideas. She talks about raising students' awareness to understand that they are often seeing just one representation of Turkey. To combat this monolithic view of culture, Layla tries to show her students that as humans, we have more commonalities than we have differences. She goes on to explain that because of this extreme focus on what makes us different based on stereotypical images, it's very important for students to appreciate the complexity and diversity that I, as someone from that society, see. One strategy for centering diversity that all of our participants valued is bringing different perspectives into social justice teaching materials. These perspectives can come from the students who might represent multilingual and multicultural identities, or they can come from target language texts. As Willa explained, what I believe belongs to the social justice dimension includes bringing in multiple, often contrasting perspectives into my class, such as exposing students to reading and listening materials that stand for different perspectives, creating opportunities for students to share different perspectives, establishing protocols for class participation, and laying out stereotypes for students to challenge and deconstruct. Another strategy LCTL teachers use for centering diversity is building understanding through cultural comparison. Our participants noted that a first step in doing this is understanding their own culture and the target cultures that they are teaching well before comparing them. Doing this involves teachers engaging in self-reflection to learn about themselves. Carolina states this eloquently when she says, "You need to know yourself, you need to know your culture, you need to know your subject and find a way to get the point across and explain it in a way that the students will understand." This preliminary work sets the stage for cultural comparison, but as Carolina goes on to explain, when you're teaching language and culture, there might be some very contentious, very difficult topics to talk about, and you need to find a way not to go around them, but to present them in a non-offensive, respectful way. The final theme that we identified in LCTL teachers' understanding of social justice in education is that it has local and global impact. Locally, within the context of the classroom, as students learn about the perspectives and experiences of others, they build empathy toward their classmates as well as toward individuals outside of their immediate context. This theme is evident in Layla's response to the question, "What do you hope your students will gain from the study of language and culture?" She said, "By making a conscious and systematic effort to integrate social justice issues into language teaching curricula, I hope to raise students' awareness on social justice issues and help them become more perceptive and empathetic readers of the world around them, and hopefully acquire a sense of social responsibility and sensibility beyond their immediate lives and concerns." Beyond the classroom, learning about social justice topics through critical pedagogies allows students to connect with target language speakers in the community, thereby making language learning and language speakers more real to them. In explaining how she wanted to structure her unit final assessment, Willa talked about having her students organize an event that connects with the Chinese-speaking community in the town where her university is located. These community members come from all parts of the Chinese-speaking world and have different experiences with the language. As Willa stated, she wanted students to take that diversity into consideration because they have a real target language population to talk to, not only people from China or who are living in China, but also from all over the place. Finally, enacting critical pedagogies has global impact in that it allows students to understand the source of societal problems and explore solutions. This work can in turn inform students' choices once they leave the university. For Carolina, making connections within and beyond the classroom achieves this goal. As she explained, the way to understand issues affecting underrepresented groups and find solutions to those issues is to know each other well. In so doing, Carolina said, we have a chance of finding solutions because unless you understand the source of these problems, what problems a person faces, there's no way you can come to an agreement or find the solution to something. Moreover, in getting to know each other well, students discover the diversity of the people around them. Carolina goes on to describe this diversity as a penetration of cultures, one outcome of which is educating truly global citizens. So I will now turn things back to Mandy, who will summarize our findings.
So the findings that Kate just presented from this particular study confirm many of the findings that we've seen in previous research. Teaching for social justice is complex for both teachers of commonly taught languages and teachers of less commonly taught language. This complexity stems from the need to identify materials beyond the textbook, the need to identify and respond to the unique backgrounds and needs of individual learners in each class, and also the need to simultaneously attend to language and cultural content. Yet for teachers of less commonly taught languages, this looks just a bit different because of the shortage of materials and the challenges of finding texts that are linguistically accessible to learners and that don't present the culture in stereotypical ways. By incorporating these texts into the classroom, however, LCTL teachers can overcome a challenge that has been previously reported in the literature, namely that cultural knowledge and awareness of the LCTL teachers is sometimes limited to their firsthand lived experiences. And for some LCTL teachers, cultural practices and perspectives have changed since they last lived in the target culture. The teacher participants in the current study emphasized the value of target language texts as they support engagement with more nuanced and complexified representations of the target cultures. Text selection, however, was a challenge as teacher participants sought out texts that were accessible both linguistically and culturally. Additionally, working with the text and teaching for social justice provided teachers the opportunity to reflect on their home culture and their experiences within it, and to consider those experiences in relation to other perspectives represented in the texts. In so doing, they avoided cultural stereotyping and created a more objective approach to social justice topics. Incorporating a variety of voices and perspectives into the classroom has repeatedly been shown to be a strategy that language teachers use to incorporate social justice into their practice. Previous work with teachers of commonly taught languages has shown that through this strategy, teachers can bring in marginalized or underrepresented voices. The LCTL participants in this study, however, were really focused on showing that the peoples who speak the target language are not one monolithic entity, but rather they speak diverse varieties, eat diverse foods, and have diverse traditions, and confront common human phenomena, such as cultural contact. Their goal is to break down stereotypes that students might have based on the way that the target culture is presented and perceived in the United States. For Layla, this meant not just making students aware that individuals with disabilities exist in Turkey, but also that individuals are working to reduce barriers that those individuals face. In other words, it's about breaking down this stereotype that students have that the target cultures might be backwards or not as advanced as their home culture. Moreover, the understandings of the LCTL teachers in this study were further complexified as they thought about their individual learners. Indeed, their talk was filled with references to their students' needs and experiences, and their curricular units were designed with those in mind. The centering of the student experience was more at the front and center than has been reported in previous research. Because LCTL teachers often teach students for multiple semesters and are responsible for recruitment, retention, and program development, they know their learners deeply and they design instruction to meet their specific needs in a way that differs from commonly taught of teachers of commonly taught languages, given the number of students that they are planning instruction for. Finally, teaching for social justice is impactful. While previous scholarship emphasizes the impact social justice teaching can have, and teachers have noted the opportunity it offers for teaching the whole student, Our participants really honed in on fostering empathy towards others, potentially because of the focus within their instructional units on common human conditions. By raising student awareness about these issues, the LICTL teachers highlighted how this prepares learners to be global citizens, familiar with multiple communities, and able to think about issues from multiple perspectives. A key piece of this work for these LICTL teachers is establishing community and even family connections. Indeed, each of the unit's summative assessments incorporated the local community in some way. Students of Russian shared their projects with the local Russian speaking community. Learners of Chinese interviewed Chinese immigrants in their university community. And students of Turkish prepared an accessible event for their local university community as well. As reported in previous scholarship, teaching and learning a LICTL can be isolating, but by establishing connections locally, the impact on students' linguistic and intercultural learning can be enhanced. In conclusion, many of the findings of previous scholarship on both LICTL teaching and language teacher understandings of social justice in language education are repeated here. However, the context in which LICTL teachers live and work shapes how these commonalities manifest themselves in their conceptual understanding and instructional practices. Most notably, their focus on their learners, their desire to complexify and diversify student knowledge and understanding of the target culture, and their efforts to connect learners with the local communities stood out. So, to better understand LICTL teachers' understandings of social justice in language education, we've situated our findings within Goodwin and Doherty's knowledge domains of teaching that Kate referenced back in our methodology, and I'm going to turn it over to her to discuss those.
Yeah, so this framework includes 5 knowledge domains for teaching that you see on the slide, and it was developed to define what teachers need to know and do in order to understand and enact teaching practices that are globally relevant and social justice oriented. Although this framework was designed to inform the work of teacher educators as they prepare what Goodwin refers to as quality teachers, these domains can also help us define what teachers know and respond to questions such as what might quality teaching mean in a global context, and what should globally competent, justice-oriented teachers know and be able to do. We were drawn to this framework because of its grounding in social justice and global competence, both of which are relevant in the context of language education. And we see the framework as a way of helping us move beyond identifying themes in our data to instead operationalize teachers' understanding of social justice education with a set of empirically and practically vetted knowledge domains. Before we present our thinking around the relationship between our findings and these knowledge domains, I do want to clarify that our thinking is preliminary and ongoing. We're still thinking through how we want to apply this framework, so we look forward to any insights or impressions that you might want to share during the question and answers time. So as you can see on the slide, we have the 5 domains of teacher knowledge are personal, contextual, pedagogical, sociological, and social. Personal knowledge is related to the beliefs, attitudes, experiences, and personal theories, that teachers bring to their classrooms and how they shape their identities and instructional decision-making. In our findings, we see ample evidence of the personal knowledge domain. For instance, LICTL teachers' comments about stereotyping, both in relation to their personal experiences and the way their cultures are represented in textbooks, reflect some negative personal experiences and beliefs that they have. Relatedly, we see participants' personal knowledge emerge when they discuss the importance of understanding themselves in order to be effective teachers of social justice. Contextual knowledge is related to teachers' ability to understand learners' needs both within and beyond the classroom, and it demonstrates teachers' understanding that these contexts are socially, historically, and institutionally situated. Our participants' contextual knowledge is evident when they discuss the need for students to understand the diverse identities and perspectives that comprise their classroom community, as we saw when Carolina talked about getting to know each other well. We also see contextual knowledge emerge when participants describe the external community connections with folks at the university, with family members, with language speakers in the region that arise through enactment of the social justice units. Third, pedagogical knowledge is connected to teachers' ability to observe and interpret their classrooms. It involves noticing students' needs and then, in response, developing and enacting appropriate pedagogical and curricular tools and practices. These tools and practices might include subject area knowledge, theories of learning, or teaching methods or approaches. And our participants demonstrated extensive pedagogical knowledge that connects to the social justice objectives of their curricular units and to the language learning needs of their students. This knowledge was evidenced in their effective selection and use of target language texts, their ability to engage students with the complexities of language, and their desire to move from personal exploration to cultural understanding and comparison. Sociological knowledge focuses on developing students' ability to understand, interact with, and respond to inequitable social structures in preparation for their future life goals. This entails teaching learners of all identities, being aware of structures and inequities in schools, and interrupting discriminatory or harmful instructional or institutional practices. We saw less evidence of sociological knowledge among our participants than we did of personal, contextual, and pedagogical knowledge. Indeed, only Layla demonstrated this knowledge domain through her focus on issues of accessibility, linguistic marginalization, and student empathy toward marginalized groups. Finally, social knowledge is related to classroom management and involves making sense of the perspectives, positionalities, and dynamics evident in the classroom. This type of knowledge can help teachers build a cooperative and democratic classroom community, make critical judgments based on classroom-based evidence, and recognize and manage dynamics among students with differing viewpoints and identities. Based upon our analyses, we did not see evidence of teachers' social knowledge. Although Willow made reference to establishing protocols for class participation, these protocols were never specified. Indeed, none of our participants described classroom structures, nor did they discuss managing multicultural dynamics among the students in their classrooms. The fact that we saw ample evidence of the first three knowledge domains for teaching is consistent with previous empirical research that uses this framework as an analytical lens. Those studies suggest that personal, contextual, and pedagogical knowledge are easier to develop through teacher education programs and professional development experiences. Conversely, the limited evidence of sociological and social knowledge in our findings, which is also consistent with previous studies, suggests that these knowledge domains are less easily taken up by teachers. To develop teachers' sociological and social knowledge domains, teacher educators might focus on helping teachers structure difficult conversations and handle critical moments in the classroom, and also helping teachers think critically about the social inequities that arise from the topics they are teaching, while also helping them think through the inequities in their own contexts that might affect some learners differently than others. This sociological knowledge is crucially linked to the content of social justice-oriented classrooms and the types of thinking in which students engage around that content. Although our participants were able to talk about social inequities related to themselves and the perspectives represented through target language texts, with the exception of Layla, they were not able to translate this knowledge to their instructional planning or practices. In addition to thinking about these knowledge domains in relation to teacher professional development, it's also important to consider the type of research that we carry out moving forward. Given that LCTL teachers' understanding of social justice and language education is closely tied to both their language teacher identity and their classroom practices, we hope to look at the interaction among all three of these in future analyses of our data. Before we open things up for question and answer, I just want to take a moment, or we want to take a moment to thank the curriculum developers in this project, as well as the 3 graduate research assistants that have supported this project, Heidi Beckman, Yokohama, and Marie Mangold. And we invite you to come see us at ACTFL. We are giving a talk on this data at ACTFL. It'll be a slightly different version of the talk. And we're also giving a talk on some of our research on student learning regarding students' critical language awareness. And so if you scan that QR code, you'll see the list of presentations that we're giving at ACTFL next week. Thanks so much for your attention, and we will look forward to your questions in the chat.
At
Oh,
this
the first
point, the
question
only
is, will we
question we
present at
have.
ACTFL?
Yeah, so both of the presentations are on Friday. One's kind of midday, one's a little bit later in the afternoon. But if you go to that QR code Kate shared, you can see the exact times and locations.
So while we're waiting for questions to roll in, I wonder maybe Karen, if she just recently put the link to the Social Justice Initiative in the chat, but that's a place where you can go and see the yeah, I'll put that QR code up again. That's a place where you can go and see the curricular units that were developed, as well as a number of other materials to support social justice and language education. And so we invite you to go check out that website. So there is a question in the chat about why we only chose to investigate native speakers. Um, so I mentioned this in the beginning when I talked about our participants. We actually had 4 LCTL participants, one of whom was a native speaker of English, and a teacher of Portuguese. And as we started working with our data and conducting our analyses, we found that her positionality vis-a-vis social justice concepts and social justice pedagogy was radically different from the teachers of languages that did not have Roman scripts and the teachers who were native speakers. And so we decided to only focus on those teachers who were the native speakers of the language and who were working in the languages that were significantly different from English. But we did have one English speaking participant. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read Sam's question out. And Mandy, I think this is about something that you talked about. So Sam said, a statement in the findings about teachers developing a more objective approach to social justice pedagogy caught my ear because so much of what you described seems embedded in context, teacher and student identities, particularity of languages and cultures, and so on. I suppose these aren't mutually exclusive constructs, but I just wondered if you could say more about what you mean by an objective approach to social justice pedagogy.
Agreed. And so I think to clarify there more than anything, what it allowed them to do is, I think, present a more, right? It allowed them to represent the target culture in a more objective way. It kind of took them out as the provider of knowledge to a certain extent and didn't rely on their knowledge base, but presented a wider view of things. And so in that sense, it's more objective, even though it is very locally grounded.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of perspective taking, I know, is not necessarily objective when we talk
Mm-mm.
about critical pedagogy, but the fact that they were bringing in all this different kind of content in a way objectified, not objectified, but made more objective what they were doing because it wasn't just based on personal opinion or previous experiences. It was based on something that other individuals from the target cultures were experiencing. And I can just add, since we didn't really talk about pedagogy very much in this talk, that the projects that the curriculum developers completed and the templates that they used were grounded in 2 critical pedagogies. The multiliteracies framework, so the work of the New London Group and Cope and Calancis that has been translated to language education by numerous scholars, and Hackman's 5 Components of Social Justice Education, which was created sort of generally to think about how to teach for social justice, but which has also been taken up in language education by numerous individuals. And so those 2 pedagogies were the ones that framed everything that these curriculum developers did. And we're waiting for more questions to come in. I can also add that if you go to the Social Justice Initiative page, we do have a research page there, and you can see some of the publications that we have already put out regarding the teachers of more commonly taught languages, in case you're interested in learning about that. We have another question. Mandy, do you want to?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. So I'm going to read it aloud. While fleshing out their conception of social justice topics, did teachers refer to language learning, or were they more focused on growing awareness of social justice? Is there a danger that teachers forget about language learning when doing social justice-based lessons? And both Kate and I are smiling because this is the tension that we see, I think, that comes out in almost all of the teachers that we've worked with, both commonly taught languages and less commonly taught languages, is they don't want to forget about the language. They really do want to attend to linguistic development while they are developing cultural understanding, complex thinking around some of these topics. The challenge is precisely how do they do that, right? That's where I think the challenge is they want to do both things, and so that's what they're grappling with. How do I counterbalance these things? How does the language support the cultural and thinking and the engagement with the different perspectives and potential injustices that students are confronting? And so I don't think, I mean, I do think there, I mean, potentially for some teachers that they may forget about language, but for the ones that we have worked with here, they are thinking about language. They're selecting their texts based on what the level of their learners, what they can engage with, as well as what linguistics or language structures they want students to acquire. And so they are being intentional about that. And part of the way that they do that is Kate referenced one of the pedagogies was the multiliteracies pedagogy, and they used that in part to support the linguistic development.
Mhm.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, a follow-up question. Wonderful. Can you hear me properly? Yeah. Can you? Great.
Yep.
My follow-up question is, did they mention that the teachers mentioned what you are referring to now, or they didn't raise that concern? Because that's really important from a point of view, you know, whether they were aware of this problem, the
Yeah.
integration
Of the problem,
of content, social justice content, and language learning. Were they aware of how difficult that is, or not really in their comments? Is it an issue that appeared in the interviews, or not
I mean,
really?
one of the things that came up, and I think it was in one of the quotes that we provided, was there was a lot of concern about the text being too difficult for them. And so they wanted to treat the social justice content, but they were worried that students didn't have the linguistic preparation to do it. There were some concerns, although we didn't talk about that here. And I think it was a little bit less prevalent in this study than it was the teachers of more commonly taught languages. They were concerned about students being able to do the kind of critical analysis that needs to happen through critical pedagogies and social justice classrooms because they lacked the language proficiency to do so. I think the other thing that came out in some of the meetings was how to structure language-focused activities that were grounded in the content and weren't just language-focused activities for the sake of building linguistic support, but also connecting that linguistic support to the ability to discuss the topics. And that's a challenge that has been documented in multiple studies of language content integration, whether it's coming from the immersion context, the CLIL context, or the post-secondary language education context. Yeah, so I hope we've answered your question.
Yes, you did, because there is a really big danger here, because sometimes lessons, foreign language lessons based on social justice, end up being conducted in the native language,
Mm.
precisely
Yeah.
because of the difficulty of the topic. You know what I mean? And we have reported that in our own studies in Spain. So, and
Yeah.
just leave it there.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the benefits of working with a member of the grant team to develop the materials, because we really tried to keep them focused on integrating those two things. Yeah. Okay.
So another question that came in is about assessment and how students' development of social justice thinking, the skills associated with that was assessed. Yes, teachers did do this. Each of them created a action-oriented summative assessment. So students were asked to create a product. They did something, right, with these new understandings, with the using the language forms that they had been practicing, so it was all done in the target language. They did something with that, and the teachers then had rubrics that they used to evaluate that. Language played a role in that rubric, as did social justice understandings. So did they use that new content and the new ways of thinking that they developed throughout the unit? Is that reflected in the product that they created?
Yeah.
Um,
And Zakia, if you go in and look at any of those curricular units that are posted on the Carla website, if you look at the unit overview document, there is an assessment plan for the unit included in that. And so not only does it make reference to the summative assessment that Mandy just described, but it's also makes reference to various formative and other summative assessments that happen throughout the lesson. And they involve things like reflection activities, quizzes, worksheets, reading guides, various other things. So you can see some examples of how they were assessed. Okay,
all
we've
right,
got,
so we've got
go ahead, Mandy.
another question that came in from Jameson about the connections between participants' academic history or professional preparation and their conceptualization of social justice, and particular about differences that might stem from the countries where they were trained or where they had
Mm,
studied. And this is a question that we too are very interested in. And I think it's potentially one of our next steps, is not so much their academic preparation, although we do have some of that, but thinking more about their identities and how they see themselves as teachers and how those intersect with what they do in the classroom and how they understand social justice teaching. But at this point, I don't think we can say anything systematic
yeah.
about this particular question.
Yeah, we do know that all three earned a PhD in the United States.
Yes.
And so, but we didn't collect background about their education beyond their sort of post-baccalaureate degrees. We did collect information about their professional development experiences. And as Mandy said, that's something that we will put into dialogue with um, their identities when we sort of look at identity, which was a very salient feature in the data. So it was actually very hard to tease out conceptualizations from identity formation in this data for us, because they were really closely intertwined. Okay, so we have a question from Estefania about text selection. Were the teachers free to choose any type of didactic material they wanted, or did you encourage them to use something in particular, such as narrative books or audiovisuals? They were able to use anything that they wanted to use, as long as they were authentic texts. I don't believe, I mean, some of them intertwined the unit with their textbook, but because this was being developed for a national audience as opposed to for a specific context, we discouraged them from tying things too closely to a textbook. And so everything was really grounded in authentic materials, but there were no restrictions on the types of materials that they could use. Um, Okay.
I'm reading Janice's
Yep.
comment as well about this need to pre-teach content. And I will say that comes out a lot, right? And
Yeah.
again, both in our commonly taught language teacher data and in this less commonly taught, like you're saying, US based students often just they lack the basics, I guess, in some way. And so they need to kind of have that contextualized knowledge, that socio-historical knowledge in which to situate what they're learning and where these texts are coming from.
Yeah, and part of that too was, I don't know if you said this, Mandy, but the teachers self-educating, right? And that was one of the
Mm-hmm.
findings that we presented today, that this self-education wasn't simply a reflection on their own experiences in the target cultures, but it was also learning about the topics that they were teaching so that they could go beyond their personal experiences before they presented that information to students and then engaged students in cultural comparison, for instance, when we think about to Carolina's quote. And we saw the same thing coming up in the teachers of more commonly taught languages, which Mandy mentioned. We had one participant in particular, who was very, very concerned about their own background knowledge, and spent hours and hours and hours reading and preparing to be able to teach the topic that they had selected for their unit. It was painstaking, the preparation that they did. Yeah. Uh, Okay, so we are hitting the top of the hour and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we want to thank you all for your attendance and for your excellent and thoughtful questions. We really love talking about this stuff, and so we were glad to have such an engaged audience. And again, if you're at Actful, please come see us. We would love to meet you in person. We'll also be at AAAL in the spring presenting on some of this stuff. So if you go to that conference, maybe we'll see you there. And in the meantime, have a wonderful afternoon. And thank you so much for participating in Carla's professional development programming.